The microphone screeched with feedback as Min-Joon's hand came down over it, cutting off the reporter mid-question. The entire press room fell into a shocked silence, the kind of silence that precedes an earthquake. Camera flashes exploded like strobe lights, illuminating the horror on every board member's face as Seoul's most untouchable CEO did the unthinkable. "I choose to believe her," Min-Joon said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. The room detonated. Chairs scraped against marble floors as 3 board members stormed toward the exit. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions over each other. His chief financial officer, Park Sung-ho, grabbed his arm with enough force to leave marks. "Have you lost your mind?" Sung-ho hissed. "The evidence is fabricated," Min-Joon interrupted, pulling his arm free. "And I can prove it." He looked to his left where Sarah stood, her spine straight, her dark skin glowing under the harsh lights, her expression a careful mask of dignity that didn't quite hide the devastation in her eyes. She had told him not to do this, had begged him, actually, in his office 3 hours ago when he'd laid out his plan. "Let me go," she'd said, her Nigerian accent thickening with emotion. "Your company is worth more than proving a point. I'll survive this. I always do." But he'd seen her hands trembling as she said it, had watched her try to hold herself together even as the world she'd fought so hard to build in Korea crumbled around her. And he'd realized something that terrified him. He couldn't let her go. Not like this. Not when he knew the truth. If you're wondering how one choice can unravel 15 years of carefully constructed power, stay with us. This is a story about trust, truth, and the dangerous line between redemption and ruin. You won't want to miss what happens next. The press conference descended into pandemonium as security moved in to restore order. Min-Joon felt Sarah's hand brush against his. Not holding, just touching, a question without words. He didn't look at her. Couldn't. If he looked at her now, with those cameras recording every micro-expression, everyone would see what he'd been trying to hide for months. That she had become the only person whose opinion of him actually mattered. "Mr. Kong, are you seriously standing by the woman who nearly bankrupted your AI division?" A reporter from Seoul Economic Daily shouted. "Ms. Johnson didn't bankrupt anything," Min-Joon replied, his voice cutting through the noise with the authority of a man who'd spent 15 years making boardrooms go silent with a single word. "Someone else did. Someone who's been stealing from this company for 18 months while you all wrote headlines about a brilliant CEO who couldn't see the rot in his own organization." The room went quiet again, but this time it was the dangerous kind of quiet. The kind that meant he'd just declared war on his own empire. His head of communications, Lee Ji-won, appeared at his elbow. "Sir, we need to leave. Now." Min-Joon nodded and turned toward the exit, his hand instinctively moving to the small of Sarah's back. A gesture of protection he immediately regretted when he saw the cameras swivel to capture it. That single touch would be analyzed, dissected, turned into a scandal by morning. They were ushered into a private elevator, followed by Ji-won and 2 security guards. The moment the doors closed, Sarah stepped away from him, putting 3 feet of space between them. Her jaw was tight, her breathing controlled, but he could see the anger simmering beneath her composure. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "I had no choice." "Everyone has a choice, Min-Joon." It was the first time she'd used his given name in front of other people, and the intimacy of it made Ji-won's eyes widen. "You chose to tie your reputation to mine." "Why?" "Because in 6 months of working beside you, I remembered what it felt like to be human. Because your questions made me think. Because your presence in my home turned it into something more than a museum of expensive things I'd bought to fill the emptiness. Because somewhere between late-night conversations about code and early morning coffee before the sun rose over Seoul, you became the only real thing in my carefully constructed life." But he couldn't say any of that. Not here. Not with witnesses and security cameras recording every word. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said instead. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The right thing. You built an empire on ruthless efficiency, and now you're making decisions based on what's right." She shook her head. "I knew you were different lately, but I didn't realize you'd changed this much." The elevator doors opened to the underground parking garage. Ji-won immediately began giving instructions to security about alternative routes and decoy vehicles. Min-Joon ignored her, his attention fixed on Sarah. "Get in the car," he said. We're going back to the house. I'm not going back there. Sarah, no. She turned to face him fully, and he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Tears she was too proud to let fall. You just destroyed your reputation for me in front of every major media outlet in Korea. The least I can do is not make it worse by living under your roof while they turn this into a scandal. I don't care what they turn it into. Well, I do. Her voice rose, echoing off the concrete walls. I care that you're throwing away everything you built. I care that tomorrow morning, your shareholders are going to demand your resignation. I care that you just made yourself a target because you couldn't stand to see an innocent person suffer. She took a shaking breath. I care about you too much to let you destroy yourself for me. The admission hung between them like a confession neither of them was ready to examine. Min-Joon felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked away since the day his careless ambition had resulted in a factory fire in Lagos 15 years ago, since the day he decided that caring about people was a luxury he couldn't afford. Then let me do this, he said quietly. Let me prove that I'm capable of choosing correctly for once in my life. Before Sarah could respond, Ji-won stepped between them. Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a serious problem. Park Sung-ho just called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. They're going to move for your removal as CEO. Min-Joon expected to feel panic at those words. Expected the familiar clench of anxiety that came with losing control. Instead, he felt oddly calm. Let them, he said. Schedule a press conference for tomorrow afternoon. I'll need access to the full financial records from the past 2 years, including the deleted files from the Hanam project. Sir, those files were destroyed. No, they weren't. Nothing is ever really destroyed. He looked at Sarah. Isn't that right? She stared at him for a long moment, understanding dawning in her eyes. You recovered them. I recovered everything. Every deleted email, every altered spreadsheet, every backdated document. I spent the last 72 hours with forensic accountants and cybersecurity specialists rebuilding the trail. He turned back to Ji-won. That's what I'll present tomorrow. Not speculation. Not gut feelings. Evidence. Ji-won looked between them, clearly trying to piece together what was happening. Evidence of what, sir? Evidence that the person sabotaging the AI division and stealing company funds wasn't Sarah Johnson. It was someone the board has trusted for over a decade. He paused. It was Park Sung-ho. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the security guards stopped moving, their hands hovering near their weapons as if financial crimes might suddenly turn violent. Sarah spoke first. Sung-ho, your CFO? Min-Joon, he's been with you since the beginning. He helped you build this company. I know. Min-Joon's voice was hollow, which is why it took me so long to see it. Why I almost didn't look at all. He met her eyes. Why I almost chose to believe the evidence pointing to you instead of trusting what I knew was true. What changed your mind? You did. 6 months ago, you walked into my office and told me there was a flaw in the Hanam project. Everyone else had signed off on it. Engineers, project managers, my entire executive team. But you, an intern who'd been with the company for 3 weeks, found the problem they all missed. He took a step closer. Do you remember what you said when I asked why you'd risk your position to speak up? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. I said that truth doesn't care about hierarchy. Truth doesn't care about hierarchy, Min-Joon repeated. That's when I started looking at everything differently. Started questioning the structures I'd built, the loyalty I'd assumed, the control I'd thought was the same thing as leadership. He glanced at Ji-won. Set up the press conference. Make sure every major outlet is there. This time, I'm not just defending Sarah. I'm exposing exactly how deep the corruption goes. They drove back to Min-Joon's house in tense silence. Sarah in one car with security, Min-Joon in another with Ji-won reviewing strategy. The house, a modern masterpiece of glass and steel perched on a hillside overlooking Seoul, felt different when they arrived. It had always been beautiful in the way museums are beautiful, perfect, cold, untouchable. But over the past 6 months, Sarah's presence had changed it. Books left open on the coffee table. The faint smell of the Nigerian stew she sometimes made on weekends. The sound of her laughter when she video called her mother in Lagos. Now it felt like a mausoleum again. Sarah went straight to the guest wing where she'd been staying, closing the door without a word. Min-Joon stood in the main living area, looking out at the city lights sprawling below, and wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if every mistake before this had been leading him here. His phone buzzed. A message from his mother. I saw the press conference. Call me immediately. Then another from his younger sister. Appa, what are you doing? The family group chat is exploding. Then dozens more, board members, investors, journalists, even old university friends he hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Had Min-Joon finally lost his mind? He silenced his phone and walked to the home office where he'd spent the last 3 days buried in financial records. The evidence was all there, laid out across his desk in neat folders that represented 18 months of systematic theft disguised as operational losses. Sung-ho had been brilliant about it, hiding transfers in legitimate expenses, timing his moves with market fluctuations, even sacrificing smaller projects to make his embezzlement look like bad luck rather than criminal intent. But he'd made one mistake. He'd framed Sarah using methods that were too clean, too perfect. When Min-Joon had started looking closely, he'd realized the evidence against her wasn't just circumstantial, it was manufactured. Every document incriminating her had been created within a 3-day window. Every witness statement followed the same linguistic patterns. Every piece of proof was just slightly too convenient. The real question was why Sung-ho had chosen Sarah as his scapegoat. Min-Joon had his theories, none of them pleasant. Sarah was visible, a young black woman in a homogeneous Korean tech company, brilliant but vulnerable, close to Min-Joon but not close enough that her destruction would raise immediate suspicions. She was, in Sung-ho's calculation, the perfect sacrifice. He'd miscalculated on one point. He hadn't anticipated that Min-Joon would care. A knock on the office door pulled him from his thoughts. Sarah stood in the doorway, changed into comfortable clothes, loose pants and a sweater that made her look younger, more fragile than the composed professional who'd faced down the press core hours earlier. Can I come in? She asked. Min-Joon nodded, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Sarah sat, her eyes scanning the folders and documents spread across every available surface. This is what you've been doing, she said. The late nights I thought you were avoiding me. You were building a case. I was trying to understand how I missed it for so long. Min-Joon leaned back in his chair. Sung-ho has been stealing from me for 18 months. 18 months, Sarah. And I didn't see it because I trusted him. Because he was there from the beginning. Because he said the right things and made the company profitable, and I confused efficiency with loyalty. You couldn't have known. I should have known. His voice was sharp, cutting. That's the whole point. I built this company on the idea that data doesn't lie, that numbers tell the truth, that if you just analyze everything carefully enough, you'll see reality clearly. But I forgot that data can be manipulated, that numbers can be made to say whatever the person controlling them wants them to say. He met her eyes. I forgot that truth requires more than just analysis. It requires trust. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of his desk. Why didn't you tell me? When you started suspecting Sung-ho, why didn't you say something? Because I needed to be sure. Because, he stopped, the truth catching in his throat. Because I was afraid I was wrong. Afraid I was seeing what I wanted to see because the alternative was losing you. The admission settled between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond the words themselves. Sarah's expression shifted, something vulnerable breaking through her careful control. What are we doing, Min-Joon? She asked quietly. What is this thing between us that neither of us will name? I don't know. That's not good enough. Not anymore. Not after what you did today. She leaned forward, her intensity cutting through the space between them. You stood in front of the entire Korean business world and chose me over your reputation. You're about to accuse your oldest colleague of betrayal. You've risked everything, and I need to know why. I need to hear you say it. Min-Joon stood and walked to the window, his back to her. The Seoul skyline glittered below, thousands of lives playing out in those buildings, none of them aware that in this house, on this hill, a man was trying to find words for something he'd spent 15 years learning to suppress. 15 years ago, I made a decision that killed 6 people, he said finally. I rushed a product to market without proper safety testing because I wanted to beat a competitor's launch date. There was a fire in a factory in Lagos. 6 workers died, including, his voice cracked, including a man named Chakwudi Johnson. He heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath behind him, heard the scrape of her chair as she stood. The scholarship program I created, Min-Joon continued. I started it because I couldn't live with what I'd done. I thought if I helped other people, if I funded education for immigrants, maybe I could balance the scales somehow. I never looked at the recipients' names, never attended ceremonies. I told myself it was about privacy, about letting them succeed without the pressure of knowing who their benefactor was. He turned to face her. But the truth is I was a coward. I was afraid to look at the faces of the people I was trying to help because I knew I'd see the faces of the people I'd hurt. Sarah's hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and dawning understanding. You, Min-Joon said. You were one of the recipients. And I didn't know until 3 months after you started working here. My HR director mentioned something about your application file, about your father's work history, and I looked into it. He took a step toward her. I should have told you immediately. Should have recused myself, sent you to work for someone else, done anything except keep you close. But I couldn't, because by then, you'd already started changing me, making me question everything I'd built my life on, showing me that control and isolation weren't strength, they were just different forms of cowardice. My father, Sarah whispered. You funded my education because you felt guilty about my father. At first, yes. But Sarah, you have to believe me. That's not why I kept you here. That's not why I'm doing this. Then why? She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. Why are you destroying your life for me? Is it guilt? Debt? Some twisted form of penance? No. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face. It's because somewhere in the last 6 months, you became the only person I trust, the only voice I actually hear, the only presence that makes this house feel like a home instead of a tomb I built to my own ambition. His thumbs brushed away her tears. It's because I'm in love with you, Sarah. And I know the timing is terrible and the circumstances are impossible, and you have every right to hate me for not telling you about your father. But that's the truth. That's why I'm doing this. Sarah stared up at him, her breathing ragged, her expression cycling through shock and anger and something else he was afraid to name. You're in love with me, she repeated, as if testing the words. Yes. The man who controls every variable and plans every outcome and trusts no one. You're in love with me. Yes. She laughed, a broken sound that was half sob. That's the most terrifying thing anyone has ever said to me. I know. Because if you can change this much, if you can go from the man who valued efficiency over everything to someone who risks his entire empire for trust. She took a shaking breath. Then maybe I can admit that I love you too. And that terrifies me, Min-Joon. It terrifies me because loving you means believing that people can change, that the systems built on exploitation and control can be dismantled, that someone who benefited from those systems can actually choose something different. Do you believe that? He asked quietly. I want to. God, I want to so badly. She pulled back from his touch, wrapping her arms around herself. But I need time. I need to process that the man I've been falling for is also the man responsible for my father's death. I need to understand what that means, what we mean, if there even is a we after everything. Min-Joon felt the rejection like a physical blow, but he nodded. I understand. Do you? Because I don't think you do. Sarah's voice was rising again, emotion breaking through. You grew up with privilege and power. You made a mistake and people died. And yes, you felt guilt, but you still got to keep building your empire. You still got to be the genius CEO, while my mother worked 3 jobs to keep me in school. You got to control the narrative while I had to fight for every single opportunity. She wiped her eyes angrily. So no, Min-Joon, I don't think you understand what it means for me to trust you. What it costs for me to believe that your feelings are real and not just another form of guilt. She was right. Of course she was right. Min-Joon had spent his entire life seeing the world through the lens of problems to be solved, obstacles to be overcome, variables to be controlled. He'd never had to fight for basic dignity. Never had to prove his worth over and over in rooms full of people who assumed his presence was a mistake. You're right, he said. I don't understand. Not really. But I want to learn. And I'm willing to wait as long as it takes for you to decide if that's something you want to. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The press conference tomorrow. You're really going to expose Sung-ho? Yes. It's going to get worse before it gets better. The board will fight back. The media will turn this into a scandal. Your reputation. My reputation was built on a lie, Min-Joon interrupted. The lie that control equals leadership. That efficiency justifies any cost. That some people matter more than others. He moved back to his desk, gathering the folders of evidence. Tomorrow, I'm going to tell a different story. One where admitting mistakes is stronger than hiding them. Where trust matters more than obedience. Where a man can recognize that everything he built was constructed on a foundation he's no longer willing to accept. That's a beautiful vision, Sarah said softly. I hope you survive it. She left the office, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Min-Joon stood alone, surrounded by evidence of betrayal and documents of redemption, and wondered if surviving was really the point anymore. Maybe the point was finally living, messily, honestly, without the careful control that had kept him safe and separate for so long. He picked up his phone and made the call he'd been dreading. His mother answered on the first ring. Min-Joon, what have you done? I made a choice, Iyama. A choice? You've made yourself a spectacle. The entire family is ashamed. Your father's friends are calling, asking if you've had a breakdown, if there's something wrong with you. There was something wrong with me, Min-Joon interrupted. I spent 15 years building walls instead of relationships, pursuing control instead of connection, trying to earn my way back to being human by funding scholarships for people I never had the courage to actually meet. He took a breath. I'm done with that. Tomorrow, I'm going to tell the truth about what I've found. And if it costs me the company, if it costs me my reputation, then that's what it costs. His mother was silent for a moment. Then, this is about that girl, the African intern. Her name is Sarah Johnson. And yes, it's about her. But it's also about me finally understanding that the version of myself I've been performing isn't who I want to be anymore. You sound like your father before he died, his mother said quietly, always talking about principles and integrity, as if those things mattered more than family security. Maybe they do, Min-Joon replied. Maybe that's what he was trying to teach me. He ended the call before she could respond and sat down at his desk to prepare for tomorrow. The press conference was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, giving the board just enough time to make their move in the morning. He'd present his evidence, name Sung-ho as the real culprit, and lay out exactly how the corruption had operated. Some people would believe him. Many wouldn't. But at least he'd be telling the truth. His phone buzzed again. A message from Sarah. I'm sorry for earlier. I shouldn't have said those things. He typed back. You should have. You were right about all of it. A pause. Then, for what it's worth, I do trust you. I'm just scared of what that means. Min-Joon stared at those words for a long time before responding. Me too. The board meeting the next morning was exactly as brutal as Min-Joon expected. Sung-ho had done his work well, turning every board member against the CEO they'd once revered. Min-Joon sat at the head of the conference table, listening to person after person question his judgment, his stability, his fitness to lead. You're jeopardizing 30,000 jobs, said Kim Hae-won, the board's oldest member. For what? To defend an intern who made critical errors. Sarah Johnson didn't make any errors, Min-Joon replied calmly. But someone wanted you to think she did. The evidence is fabricated. All of it. Min-Joon opened his laptop and projected financial records onto the screen. These are the real numbers from the AI division over the past 18 months. Notice the discrepancies between these and the official reports? Someone has been systematically siphoning funds and disguising the theft as operational costs and project failures. Sung-ho leaned forward, his expression perfectly calibrated concern. Min-Joon, I understand you're under a lot of stress. Perhaps you should take some time. You made one mistake, Min-Joon interrupted, his eyes locked on his CFO. You got greedy. Most of your theft was hidden in legitimate expenses, small enough to avoid detection. But 3 months ago, you needed a larger amount. So you invented a failure in the Hanam project, blamed it on Sarah, and used the chaos to cover a transfer of 40 million won. The room went silent. Sung-ho's face remained perfectly neutral, but Min-Joon saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. That's a serious accusation, Sung-ho said carefully. Yes, it is. Which is why I spent the last 72 hours with forensic accountants verifying every detail. Min-Joon pulled up another screen. These are the deleted files from the Hanam project servers. Deleted by you, from your personal login, at 2 in the morning on March 15th. The same night the funds were transferred. Anyone could have used my login. The security cameras show you entering the building at 1:43 a.m. and leaving at 3:27 a.m. There's footage of you at your desk, Sung-ho. And before you claim you were working late, I should mention that I also have the emails you sent to yourself from Sarah's account. The ones you used to create a paper trail implicating her. Min-Joon stood and walked slowly around the table, his voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the room. You chose Sarah because you thought she was vulnerable. An immigrant, an intern, someone without powerful connections. You thought I wouldn't look too closely because the evidence seemed so clear. And you were almost right. I almost didn't look. Almost chose the easy path of cutting her loose and moving on. He stopped behind Sung-ho's chair. But then I remembered something. Sarah once told me that truth doesn't care about hierarchy. And I realized that if I really believed that, if I truly meant to run a company based on integrity rather than just efficiency, then I had to apply that principle even when it was uncomfortable. Even when it meant investigating my oldest friend. Sung-ho finally broke, his carefully controlled expression cracking. You would destroy me for her? After everything I've done for this company? I was there from the beginning, Min-Joon. When everyone else doubted you, I believed. And this is how you repay that loyalty. You weren't loyal, Min-Joon said quietly. You were useful. There's a difference. And I'm done confusing the two. He moved back to his seat and addressed the full board. I've already provided all of this evidence to the prosecutors. They'll be here within the hour to take Sung-ho into custody. As for my position as CEO, I'm not resigning. But I am proposing major structural changes to how this company operates. Changes that will make it much harder for this kind of betrayal to happen again. What kind of changes? Kim Hae-won asked, her expression unreadable. Transparent financial reporting at every level. Independent audits conducted quarterly instead of annually. A whistleblower protection program that actually protects whistleblowers instead of punishing them. He paused. And a new leadership structure that distributes decision-making authority instead of concentrating it all in one person who can be manipulated or corrupted. The room erupted in objections. Min-Joon let them argue, let them express their outrage and fear, and realized he felt strangely calm. This was the right thing to do, regardless of whether they accepted it. For the first time in 15 years, he was making a decision based not on what would be most profitable or most efficient, but on what kind of company, what kind of man he wanted to be. The prosecutors arrived as promised. Sung-ho was escorted from the building in handcuffs, his face a mask of betrayed fury. The board voted to suspend judgment on Min-Joon's proposals pending further investigation, which he took as a small victory. At least they hadn't immediately demanded his resignation. The press conference that afternoon was less chaotic than the previous day's disaster. Min-Joon presented his evidence methodically, answered questions with careful precision, and watched the narrative shift in real time. By the time he finished, reporters were already filing stories with headlines like Tech CEO exposes corruption in own company, and Kang Min-Joon chooses truth over tradition. Sarah watched from the back of the room, her expression unreadable. When it was over, when the cameras finally stopped rolling and the reporters filed out, she approached him slowly. You did it, she said. We'll see. The prosecutors still have to build a case. The board still has to approve the changes. And I still have to figure out if I'm capable of actually leading a company that values trust over control. He looked at her. But yes, I did it. The story about my father. About the Legos factory fire. Are you going to make that public too? Min-Joon shook his head. That's your story to tell, if you choose to tell it. I've caused your family enough pain. I won't compound it by using your father's death for my own redemption narrative. Sarah studied his face for a long moment. You've changed so much in 6 months. Sometimes I look at you, and I can't reconcile the man standing in front of me with the reputation that preceded you. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know yet. She reached out and took his hand. The first time she'd voluntarily touched him since the revelation about her father. But I think I want to find out. If you're willing to be patient with me while I figure out what forgiveness looks like. I'll wait as long as it takes, Min-Joon said. I've spent 15 years running from the consequences of my mistakes. I'm done running. The aftermath was messy and complicated and nothing like the clean resolution Min-Joon had once preferred. The trial took 6 months. Sung-ho fought every charge, dragging out the proceedings with expensive lawyers and media manipulation. The company's stock price fluctuated wildly. Several board members resigned. Competitors sensed weakness and made aggressive moves into their market space. But something else happened too. Employees started speaking up about problems they'd previously hidden. Innovation increased as people felt safer taking risks. The company's reputation shifted from ruthlessly efficient to ethically committed, which turned out to be surprisingly good for recruiting top talent. Sarah stayed, but on her own terms. She moved out of Min-Joon's house and into her own apartment in Itaewon. She accepted a full-time position in the company's AI division, reporting to someone other than Min-Joon to avoid any appearance of impropriety. They saw each other carefully, publicly, as colleagues learning to navigate a complicated history. Privately, late at night when the rest of Seoul was sleeping, they talked about her father and the life he'd wanted for her, about Min-Joon's guilt and his journey towards something like forgiveness, about what it meant to build a relationship on a foundation of acknowledged harm rather than pretending the past didn't exist. "I don't think I can forget what happened," Sarah told him one night, sitting across from him in a quiet cafe near her apartment. "Every time I look at you, part of me remembers that you're the reason I grew up without a father." "I know," Min-Joon said, "but another part of me sees the man who chose truth over power, who risked everything to protect me, who's trying, really trying, to be better than he was." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I don't know if those two things can coexist. If I can hold both the harm and the hope at the same time." "I don't know either," Min-Joon admitted. "But I think maybe that's the point. Maybe real relationships aren't about resolving everything neatly. Maybe they're about choosing each other anyway, even when it's complicated and painful and unclear." Sarah smiled, sad and beautiful. "That's very different from the man who wanted to control every variable." "You changed me." "No," she corrected. "I gave you permission to change yourself. There's a difference." The trial ended with Sung-ho convicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to repay everything he'd stolen. The vindication felt less satisfying than Min-Joon expected. Mostly, he just felt tired and ready to focus on building something new rather than defending what had been. The board eventually approved his proposed reforms, though not without significant modifications and compromises. The company reorganized into a more distributed leadership structure. Min-Joon remained CEO, but with less absolute authority and more accountability measures. It was messier, slower, more prone to conflict. It was also healthier. 1 year after the press conference that nearly destroyed everything, Min-Joon stood in the same room preparing for a very different kind of announcement. The company was launching a new initiative, a partnership with universities in Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya to create technology training programs and job pipelines. It was Sarah's idea, her vision for how to honor her father's memory by creating opportunities for others. She stood beside him now as he addressed the gathered press, no longer his assistant or his employee, but his partner in this particular venture. They'd defined their relationship carefully over the past year. Professional collaboration, deepening friendship, and something more that neither of them was quite ready to name publicly. "This program exists because someone taught me that truth doesn't care about hierarchy," Min-Joon said, looking directly at Sarah. "Because someone showed me that real leadership means admitting when you're wrong and working to make it right. Because someone had the courage to speak up even when it was dangerous, and in doing so, changed not just a company, but the person running it." After the press conference, they walked together through the building that had been the site of so much conflict and transformation. Employees greeted them warmly, not with the fearful deference Min-Joon had once commanded, but with genuine respect. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked as they stood looking out at Seoul from Min-Joon's office window. The absolute power, the control, the certainty that came with always knowing you were right. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Usually at 3 in the morning when I can't sleep because I'm second-guessing a decision. Or when the board challenges me and I can't just override them." He turned to face her. "But then I remember what that control cost me. How isolated I was. How empty everything felt." He reached for her hand, a gesture that had become familiar over the past year. "I don't miss it enough to go back." "Good," Sarah said. "Because I don't think I could love the man you used to be. But this version, the one who's still figuring things out, who admits when he's wrong, who's willing to be uncertain, him I could love. Him I think I do love." It was the first time she'd said it clearly, without qualification or hesitation. Min-Joon felt something settle in his chest, a rightness he'd been chasing for 15 years without knowing what he was looking for. I love you too, he said. And I know our history is complicated. I know there are things that can never be fully resolved. But I want to keep trying. Keep building something real instead of something perfect. Sarah pulled him close, her forehead resting against his. Something real sounds terrifying. Completely terrifying. But worth it. Yes, Min-Joon said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. Absolutely worth it. They stood together as the sun set over Seoul, two people who'd found each other through crisis and stayed through the harder work of rebuilding. The company would continue evolving. The past would always be present. The future was uncertain in ways Min-Joon had once found intolerable. But for the first time in his carefully controlled life, he wasn't afraid of that uncertainty. Because he'd learned something more valuable than any amount of power or control. That real strength came not from having all the answers, but from being willing to ask the questions. Not from protecting yourself from pain, but from staying present through it. Not from commanding obedience, but from earning trust. And trust, Min-Joon had discovered, was worth risking everything for. Thank you for staying with Min-Joon and Sarah through their journey of truth, trust, and transformation. This story reminds us that real change requires more than just good intentions. It demands the courage to dismantle the very systems we've built our lives upon. That love isn't about perfection, but about choosing each other through complexity and pain. That some mistakes can never be fully repaired, but acknowledgement and sustained effort toward justice can create something new and worthwhile. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more narratives that explore the messy, difficult, beautiful work of becoming better than we were. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between loyalty to a system and commitment to truth? What did that choice cost you, and what did it teach you? Until next time, remember that the most courageous thing we can do is admit we were wrong and work every day to be better.